I thought this was an interesting photo. You got a big beluga right there in the front there, clearly smiling away, clearly happy about the situation. And so this is Little Whale River, which is in the high part of Quebec, going into Hudson's Bay. And you can see here's a seal float. So to keep attaches the harpoons, so it keeps the whale, when they do dive, it tires them out. And so then when they're finished, the whale doesn't sink. So you can take a look at that kayak. It's super long and skinny. Compared to this one, this is from Greenland, not very far away, but you got a much smaller design. And again, they had various designs, so this isn't just, this is a Greenland kayak, so I'm kind of being cautious of that. But, you know, a much smaller boat. This particular photo, they're not wearing there isn't like a skirt like in other areas, and you can see it's a big giant, this is really high right through here, so it keeps the paddler a little bit drier. When is this? 1872 in that time frame. But again, a much shorter boat. This is probably much closer to the lengths of the boats. We would be 16 feet or so. But if you take a look here, we'll go over to Alaska. This is a much bigger, you know, it's probably a similar length, but really deep. Look at the size of that coaming up there at the top, and a big, huge, the deck is really upswept to shed the water for what they're doing. 1930. And then I threw this in because I thought it was great. 1934, someone's doing a marathon or a sprint race of some type with, this guy here is all excited, he's getting ready to organize this thing. But kayaks weren't the only boats that northern people had. Other ones were umiaks, which were popular. They were the freighter boats. So while the kayaks were for just a single person, the women could paddle around in an umiak and carry the family, and they were huge, big, giant boats. Again, same idea with a frame and a skin hull on the outside. There's not a lot of use now, because as soon as modern European came in, they switched to much more modern boats with engines on the back. But these could be sailed, they could be paddled. So what was that? 1897. There's another one. So they were really practical because they could carry everything, and they could sledge them as needed to go for an ice or water. But we're going to talk about the modern history of kayaking. So that's kind of just jumping over 4,000 years super fast. But we want to start with, this is what we're really chatting about today. Look at that guy. So we'll start at the beginning, and we're going to cover 120 years really quick, because I want to jump into like the 70s and the 80s. It's really the part that I'm really keen about. So while people paddled kayaks for around 4,000 years, that wasn't ever viewed as a sport. The sport of kayaking started in 1865. So John McGregor in the UK, he's kind of credited with the idea of using a kayak as a recreational activity as opposed to a hunting tool. So he invented the sport of kayaking, and he designed the Rob Roy canoe, and this is one of the originals, and he commissioned a boat builder to build 5 or 6 of these boats, and it was kind of a hybrid between a canoe and a kayak and a sailboat. And what makes him really famous is because he made a lot of money off of it. And so he wrote these books, and he paddled around the UK and sold this idea of going down the Thames River on a nice day. And he wrote these books, 1,000 Miles in the Rob Roy Canoe, a series of like 6 or 7, and sold them. And they were super popular in that time frame. And it really captured the people's imagination of they were something different than just a rowboat paddling around. 1866, he helps starts the Royal Canoe Club, because he wanted to get a bunch of people together to go kayaking or canoeing, plus so they could then buy his books as well. So John McGregor was a founding member of the London, the Royal Canoe Club, which was on the Thames. So we'll jump ahead to 1907, Klepper folding kayaks, they started, and at the time, Klepper folding kayaks were the most sought after kayaks. So it was a folding kayak. Who's heard of Kleppers? Yeah, there we go. I mean, they've been around since 1907. They feel that by the 1930s, they sold 500,000 folding kayaks in that time frame. And everybody wanted a Klepper, and they were really popular because they tapped into the recreational market, but the competitive market as well. And so they built a whole bunch of race boats that could be folded up and traveled around. And that really kind of got people started. And this was before fiberglass and aluminum and all the, like what we're thinking, aluminum canoe. And so the science material was still using like wood and canvas, and that's Clipper really got going. There was many other folding kayak companies in that time frame, but they were the most popular of the era. 1936, kayaks were in the Olympics for the first time, and that was the first in Germany, and it really captured, that was when kayaks as a competitive side was on the world stage for the very first time. So 1950s, we'll jump ahead. So the Seattle Canoe and Kayak Club starts. These photos are not from the 1950s, but they looked old, so I put them in. So what makes the Seattle Club unique is while there were many other kayak clubs, there was a Washington Kayak Club that was out nearly 60 years before this. These guys were the first club that really focused on recreational paddling as well as a big competitive paddling piece, but in particular, they really pioneered the idea of using a kayak to go on a camping trip. And so they came right up to your neck of the woods, right here, and so they pioneered a lot of trips on Vancouver here and up in Alaska. And so, man, the internet doesn't have a lot of photos when you say, old photo of kayak people camping on trip. These are the only ones that came up. Somewhere on the West Coast. It's from Werner Paddles family from the 60s. So that was a big era back then. So they were the first to really think about using the kayaks as a method of transportation as opposed to just racing. And in that era, this is the same type of time frame, but the idea was fiberglass was really, as a material science, the fiberglass was just starting to come into play. And if you wanted a boat, you had to build it yourself. And so the club had several different molds that were designed, that they used, but you would borrow it for half the winter and you had a month to finish your boat because someone else needed it in line. There was really no market to buy a boat back then, especially fiberglass one. So we're jumping ahead to the 70s. We're getting close here. Whitewater manufacturing as an activity really starts to take off. People were doing whitewater long before, but now people were making whitewater boats commercially. But sea kayaking as an activity, there was hardly anybody who was doing it, and there was really no commercial side of it still at this point. But a big thing happened. 1970s, there was massive layoffs at Boeing in Seattle. And this is a pivotal moment for the outdoor industry, for both paddling, but in general. Because what happened is there was a whole bunch of aerospace engineers, material scientists, designers, and they all got laid off from work, and they needed something to do. So they started building outdoor gear, and then they started making companies to make some money off of it. And so even to this day, a lot of the outdoor industry is still based out of Seattle because it leads back to this particular point. It's spread to other areas, but a lot of companies are there. So out of that period, so JanSport, they made knapsacks, they still make them today. Cascade Designs, which makes one of their brands, Thermarest, they're owned by MSR. They came out of this era. Pacific Water Sports, which was a sea kayak company that started a couple of years after this. Eddy Line Kayaks. Ooh, there's a beautiful Eddy Line right there. So, it's on sale. I'll give you $400 right now. You can buy this boat. So they came out of this whole thing. So they were all looking for something to do, and they were bored, and they knew about, in particular, they knew about design, and in particular, they knew about materials, because they were working for Boeing at the time. So this was a big deal. 1976, we're now getting right into the sea kayak side of things. The first crossing of the North Sea. This was kind of one of the very few pieces that the press really picked up on. So Derek Hutchinson, he paddles across from the UK into Belgium along 31 hours, 90 miles to do it. That's and so he paddles. There was another guy who paddled with them, but Derek Hutchinson certainly never talks about the other guy. But, so Derek Hutchinson crossed the North Sea. I found in a very small print there was a second guy. And so this is, while this is certainly not the first time that a large crossing happened, this was the first time that the press really picked up on it from that perspective. 1980, here we are, just around the corner for you guys. The first dedicated sea kayak shop opens. John Dowd opens Eco Marine. And this is important because while there were other shops selling sea kayaks, they were other shops that happened to be selling sea kayaks. This is the first one that he felt that there was a big enough market to make a dedicated sea kayak shop. He also wrote the, not the first book on sea kayaking, but he gives sea kayaking its name. And so he coined the term sea kayaking, and before that, runner-up names were kayak touring, sea canoeing, which is terrible, blue water paddling, which is even worse, coastal paddling. These were all runners-up and different names. So this book came out, and really kind of now there's a lexicon that people can anchor around, which is great. So it's still a great book today. It's been updated over the years, and it now gave the ability to go, oh, people do use kayaking for trips, and how do I get started into it? My last slide, the industry starts to now catch up. So 1982, the sea kayak industry is created with the Trade Association of Sea Kayaking. TASC is what they were. And so this was created out of Seattle, because the problem is these manufacturers needed money. And so they would go to a bank and they'd say, I need a loan. And they'd say, wonderful, how can I help you? And they would say, I'm thinking of starting a sea kayak company. And they would say, what is that? And nobody even understood this thing. And it was very confusing to bank managers everywhere. And so what they needed was some type of thing to legitimize the industry. And that's what the Trade Association of Sea Kayaking did. They all got together and they legitimized themselves so they could get capital, and they could start manufacturing, and they could start to look at some things around standardization, for pricing, for marketing, and that type of stuff. So, but really it was about credibility of the industry. And this is a pretty pivotal point, because without capital, you couldn't get boats and gear and things like that. Okay. Sea kayaking nerds got super excited in 1984 when Sea Kayaker magazine came out and started publishing magazine. Who read that magazine? There you go, a few old timers way in the back there I can see. When did it die? Kind of when all the magazines died. But it was really good. It was a magazine that was specifically for sea kayakers, really detailed about everything. There's no reason to have a 1,000-word article when you can have a 5,000-word article about someone's trip, but people loved it. And then this is my last bit. 1984, the first rotomolded sea kayak came out. And it was by Perception. It was the Aquaterra Chinook. And it was the first rotomolded or plastic boat. They had been building whitewater rotomolded boats, plastic boats before this, but they had a hard time really kind of coming up with the technology on how to make a big giant one. And Lee Moyer, was a designer from Seattle area, and he put this boat together. And this was the first one. So now, for the first time, manufacturers can easily make boats at a much lower price than fiberglass, and the public can buy in on it. And that's it right there. I paddled it once. It was a terrible boat, but there it was. So, 1984, now sea kayaking. I believe this is the point when the industry has caught up, the public has caught up, and people are buying and they're paddling all around. So, in the late 70s and the 80s, there was a bunch of different paddling scenes around the world. I'll talk about North America in a second. But there was 3 big places where the people, let me slide this over here so you can see. So, United Kingdom was the big one that really where a lot of modern sea kayak design and stuff came out of. Sydney in New Zealand, or Sydney in Australia and New Zealand itself, there was a really strong community in that time period, and these are different from some of the other kayaking communities in Europe, like France, Germany. Those were much more competitive focused. South Africa had a really strong kayaking competitive focus in this area, but these 3 were the ones that, while there was racing, we're talking about recreation, which is what I'm interested in. So they kind of all sprung up at the same time. And they had, obviously they were far enough apart that they had their own boats and their own culture. So it was kind of an interesting piece how that came up. In North America, there was 3 big ones at the time. We got Seattle and Vancouver, that's you guys, in case you didn't know. Well, Victoria, sorry, I should have edited that to say that. Northern California had a big paddling scene in that, this is kind of the early 80s. And the Great Lakes also had a really large paddling scene. There's a couple smaller ones. So Georgian Bay, which is just part of the Great Lakes as well. Maine and Florida was big into kayaking in that era. Well, they still are, but you know. But I want to talk about Northern California because it's an interesting place that had a bunch of interesting weirdos who liked to kayak in that time frame. And it was the Tsunami Rangers is the name of these guys. And really interesting piece. They're crazy, but we'll talk about it in a second. So in 1984, Eric Soares and Michael Powers, these two guys get together and they're like, kayaking on flat water is really boring. And kayaking on a wave is super boring. How can we make this crazier? And let's start a gang of people together and let's go in the rough water. So Northern California and Oregon, 1984, these guys are out paddling around having a great time. And they started making a bunch of videos in this time frame. And a little bit later when the technology came in, they were videotaping. Just a short little loopy-loop here. So, crazy. And even to this day, I think these guys are the craziest guys ever. But I think some really interesting pieces out of this. So, they were way ahead of their times in what they felt a kayak could do, and the gear wasn't there, and the equipment wasn't there, and so they either built their own gear or they found gear in other sports. So they were looking for safety gear, so obviously motorcycle helmets. They grabbed a lot of equipment from the dirt bike side of things, like chest protectors and shoulder protectors. And they had a very unique perspective around risk management. So while that video looks really crazy on one level, and it is, they had a whole hidden framework on how to keep themselves so that they didn't get injured or killed. So they had a very strong philosophy of learning through experience, both good and bad. They weren't quite as risk averse as regular people were, which was great because what they had a whole structure of almost like the Navy of different ranks, and so as you worked your way up, you would have different decisions. You could help make decisions and help look and take care of people who weren't quite as experienced. So they were unique in the fact that they did all this stuff, but they also built a really strong recreational or risk management framework around it, which at that time frame wasn't quite thought about quite as much. And so they built their own gear, but I was really fascinated with the fact that they built their own kayaks because the market, there was nothing on the market for it. And so what they were doing is obviously very specialized. So they designed their own boats. They were really interested in sit-on tops with these giant seat belts to strap them in and keep them on board. But their boats had the best names. Look at that thing. There's the X3 Trident and the Rum Runner and the X15 Scramjet. The X2 Starship apparently was this massive two-seater, two-person rough water boat. Super strong boats. They were building all these Kevlar boats long before everybody else were. And apparently people loved them, but I don't know how well they paddled, but certainly rough water they paddled great. But I definitely would buy a Scramjet just purely because of the name. So Northern California, they really pushed the envelope in what a kayak could do from that perspective. But if you look at the Great Lakes was another part, and I want to chat about that because it's different from where you guys are right now. It's where I am, and that's my paddling areas in the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes in the early 80s really was one of the main centers of kayaking in North America, which is weird because it's all freshwater. But it really was. And it mainly was because of this guy, Stan Schlatic. He was the owner of Great River Outfitters. And Great River Outfitters was in the Detroit area, and it was both a shop to sell stuff, but he was a distributor, and so he was the main distributor. He would bring in British boats, and if you were a shop like this, you had to work with Stan Schlatic and get the boats in your shop. He was the first guy to really bring in British boats and more importantly, British instructors to North America to train under like a BCU program. So he was a big believer in both certification or training, but in particular British thing. He had a lot of friends there, so it was easy. He was from Czechoslovakia before he moved to North America, and he was a champion whitewater guy. So he doesn't know anything about North America. He decides to move to Detroit, which is flatter than possible. There's no white water there. He was super disappointed when as soon as he showed up, apparently. But he got into sea kayaking, and so he realized that the Great Lakes could be a wonderful destination for both paddling on small trips or large trips, but in particular for surfing, playing in rocks, and that type of thing. So he ran this business with this goal to make the Great Lakes as a world-class paddling destination. And it is, for sure. And so that was his goal. So he'd bring these people in, but he was all about rough water paddling. 1984, he started 2 key events at the same time. Something's here saying something here. Oh my goodness, it's all falling apart. Okay, so he started 2 key events. The first one was the Great Lakes Sea Kayak Symposium, and it was on the South Shore of Lake Superior. For us on the Great Lakes, you know, we have 5 Great Lakes, and they're all great. But really the best one is the Superior. Everybody wants to go there. It's hard to get to. It's super remote. It's very rugged. So he started this kayak symposium, similar to some of the other symposiums that you might have been to, but it was the second big one that got started. And in its peak, it would have like 900 people at it, which I find incredible today, because you could have a symposium today and everybody's loving the fact that 100 people were there. So that was this big one that he had. That was open to the public and really introduced kayaking to it. In fact, it was a big enough deal that this photo here is from that event, and somebody from NBC, you can see by the camera there, is interviewing. There's Derek Hutchinson in the middle, probably bragging about something he did. This is Frank Goodman, who is the owner of Valley one of the main designers of Valley Kayaks. There's Stan right there doing something, staring and yelling at it. Anyways, that was his thing. So he yelled. He did do that a lot. But he did the Great Lakes Sea Kayak Symposium. His other one which I feel was the more influential one, which is the event that nobody knows about, was the Gales of November Rendezvous, which also happened on Lake Superior, but it took place in Agawa Bay. He started in 1984, and it went till probably about 2002 or 3, and it kind of petered out a little bit after that, but its heyday was mid-80s to the end of the 2000s. So the kayaks have been used for crossings and crossing large bodies of water for a long time. So there's a lot of modern stories of people who have rowed and kayaked and sailed across the oceans. There's stories of kayaks of people who have paddled from Greenland to Iceland and then into the United Kingdom as far back as 200 years ago. These anecdotal stories. And so I read a story of a guy, 2 guys who kayak through here in Florida. All these interesting stories. And while kayaks have been used for, we think about crossing these massive big things, in North America, generally, we don't really do a lot of crossings. If you're on the ocean and you're gonna commit to a long crossing, Japan is pretty far away, but on the Great Lakes, it's a whole different weird world of people. And on the Great Lakes, there's a small group of people who really embrace paddling on crossings, and I want to tell you a story about one of them. But we have a couple of set crossings of people who want to paddle. If you're going to paddle on, say I paddle across Lake Erie, there's kind of a set one. It follows the same type of model as people who swam the Great Lakes. They have these specific set, start from this city to that city. That's the set route for swimming. And kayaking kind of follows the same thing. But Lake Superior, so these are all smaller, and the reason why we kind of embrace paddling to crossing is, well, there's always a shoreline on the other side. So whether you want to paddle 15 kilometers or 60 kilometers, you're willing to do it, there's shoreline on the other side. Lake Superior is an interesting spot for it, and it's got a bunch of crossings, but just kind of give you an idea of anybody who's never been there, it's pretty big. It's 470 kilometers in that section. So, you can move the arrows around and make it longer, but I tried to keep it simple. So it's 470 kilometers long. So the wind blowing
it behaves exactly the same as the ocean, except there's no salt, and there's, it doesn't go up and down. It's 250 kilometers across, and if you decided to paddle around it and do all the islands, it's 4,400 kilometers. And there's people who do it every year, and it's kind of an interesting piece. I've done a lot of guiding up on this area, so it's pretty awesome. So they have their own little set of crossings as well, but what makes this tricky is the water is super cold, and it's colder than the ocean because it freezes in the wintertime, so at certain points of the year it's way colder, and it's really rugged. There's just not a lot of people up there. There's very few resources to help back you up if you needed help for it. And so mainly there's a bunch of offshore islands and people paddle out to them. So like this small one here, this little crossing here is 25 kilometers. 4 hours and you got it done, and you're terrified the entire time. But in particular, there's Agawa Bay. And Agawa Bay is the same location as where Stan Schlack, he had his big event. And this is in particular, it's a bay that for the local people who live in that area, the local First Nations, it's a very historic place. There's pictographs in that area. There's a lot of stuff that's there. It's a very hot, it's an incredible place to go to. So I want to tell a story about a crossing that happened in that. But before we get into that, so there's a quick history lesson within a history lesson. This is like the inception of history lessons. So the Beaver Wars is a war that happened in Canada that you never heard about in school. 1640 to 1701, the Iroquois are trying to expand their territory westward and take over the fur trade from the French. So the French are running the fur trade for all around the Great Lakes and the Midwest area and Ontario and Quebec, and the Iroquois are trying to take over. So the British give them some money and they fund this war that goes on for just over 60 years. And as time goes on, they work their way south to the north to take over the industry. So there's all these battles that happen. Again, nobody talks about it, but it did happen. In the 1600s, Iroquois, in the 1660s, so this is 20 years into it, they make their way to Lake Superior, and in particular Sault Ste. Marie, which is in the bottom corner, and they start going to war against the local Anishinaabe people who live there. Now, they're cousins. This is Sault Ste. Marie. They're cousins over here. They're not happy about it, so the call goes out, and Chief Mayagun, who lives in that area, he sends 50 warriors to make a great crossing across Lake Superior. They took 4 canoes, and it took 3 days to make this crossing. And they get over there, and they bring in reinforcements to fight against the Iroquois. And we know this story because there's a pictograph in Agawa Bay that tells the story about the Great Mayagun Crossing. And it's fascinating that there's just a drawing on a rock telling a story about this crossing 400 years ago. And so there's, anybody been to Agawa Rocks? Oh, you should go. I see a couple hands there.
I can't. I would have been like 10 if I did, but we went through there on a summer road trip, so
definitely
saw a lot of different things. Yeah.
These are pictographs that it's right in the provincial park. If you ever happen to go by, take an hour. It's world-class pictographs. It's on this massive cliff. They're amazing, and they're all about water, and they're really cool. They tell the story of the area. And so there's these pictographs that are on this panel. This is just a drawing to help you actually see them, because some of them are hard to see. And this particular pictograph has 4 canoes, has a bunch of different symbols representing the different families that were part of the clans that were part of the crossing. And there's other pictographs on the other side in Keweenaw Peninsula that tell the story over in this area, but it has some moons in it to tell them how many days they've been out. So let's fast forward to 1997. It was a good year for music, good year for rock and roll, and a good year for this crossing. These guys here. So I got 3 characters: Bill Newman, Don Diamond, and Brian Day. Bill Newman and Don Diamond were on a road trip, and they stopped at Agawa Rock, and they hiked down, and they saw the thing, and they read the little story about it. It's just a 1-sentence piece, and they get this idea to recreate the story, or recreate the crossing. Brian had to drop out because he had a shoulder injury, so they trained for a year, and he had to drop out at the last minute. So the plan was to do it in a phase of 3 crossings over 5 days. The distance for it is 251 kilometers to be exact. So in 5 days. So the first phase was to to leave off the very tip here, paddle around, get out to Standard Rock Lighthouse. So that first run is 60 kilometers. The next one they were going to do is they were going to paddle straight. It was 23 kilometers to Caribou Island, and then the last leg, pulling them into Agua Bay, 83 kilometers. So they start leg 1, and they cross out, and things are going good. They start paddling around, and they get out to this point, and they go pee for the last time, and they check their deck compass to make sure everything is great. And their kayaks, the deck compasses are off by like 25 degrees from each other. And they thought, that's a problem. So they unpack their boat, and they realize that under the compass, it's a whole bunch of cans of stew. It's under there. I thought, oh, that's kind of a great start to this. So they get out to Standard Rock, and Standard Rock is a really interesting lighthouse. So it's 40 kilometers from land, from the nearest land. So when you're there, there's no shoreline. Like, it's land everywhere. It's described as the loneliest lighthouse in North America, and it's the furthest offshore lighthouse of anyone within the United States. In Canada, there's a couple that are farther, like Sable Island or Sable Island and that type of stuff in Nova Scotia. That's like 200 kilometers. But for this is fine. Standard Rock when it was built, was this engineering marvel. Built in 1878. What they did is they built it on land. So all it is, it's a lighthouse that there's a shoal that's there, and the rocks are about 3 feet underwater. And that's generally a bad thing for boats. And so they couldn't just build a lighthouse there. They had to build it on shore to start with, and then ship all these rocks out there and rebuild it again out on site. Apparently it cost like $500 million in today's money. Small exaggeration, but something like that. So apparently that's how it was described. Lonely is the only way to describe it. And the lighthouse keepers, they would go, the quote was great, "We went for days without talking, there just wasn't anything to say." So there was 2 people that lived out there, 7 stories, and that big platform is 80 feet across. And there's there's nothing to, you can pace it, but like, it's kind of like definitely a jail cell for sure. The guy who held it the longest, Louis Wilk, he was from Marquette, which is due south of it, in the closest town. And he was the lighthouse keeper for a long time, but they had to rotate people out. He held the record, so he was there for 99 days. Apparently he almost went crazy, but, and so they on policy, they would just rotate people 3 weeks off and 3 weeks back. And there was just this constant looking for new people, because they would start with high hopes, and then they would find another job after 3 weeks. That's kind of how this place was. So Standard Rock Lighthouse. So these guys start paddling out to it, and you can see the immediate problem with trying to get a kayak up that piece there. You can't land this thing, and there's nowhere to stand. And so as you can see, it's just a ladder straight into it. These photos are not great. They were, so I apologize, they were sent to me as kind of rough, but you get an idea from a distance away. They did know that beforehand that this was going to be a problem, so they brought pulleys and they practiced on an abandoned train bridge, which I thought, wow, that was great. So they practiced hoisting it up on back at their house for a little bit. But what they didn't realize is, while they knew they could get it, when they're out there, they realized, well, they couldn't get it over that fence. So they had to unpack the boats while the boats are hanging off the edge of the thing, 30 feet off of it. And that's really deep water right there. So if you drop anything, it's generally a bad thing, because it's going to sink all the stuff. So, yeah, it proved to be super hard, and it was really windy apparently at that point. And that's where they kind of thought, oh my goodness, what have we got ourselves into? Because, like I said, you can't see anything around. And there was a dead seagull on that piece hanging right beside them. So they leave the next morning, so they sleep, they get up the next morning, and so there they are stuck out in the middle, and they head out, and there's not a lot of wind, everything's looking great, and they start probably about 6 a.m., And at 8 o'clock that night, the fog rolls in, and it's described as 30 feet of visibility. So they had to be kind of stay on top of each other because they would lose track of each other. Waves are still less than a foot, but waves in fog, where you can't really see anything, is a problem. And this is what they discovered: is when the fog came in, they're right in the middle of a massive shipping channel. And there's a lot of shipping on the Great Lakes, especially between, as they travel back and forth, a lot of steel and ore. Ore is what gets taken down to the steel mills to turn into cars. And so there's a lot of boats that go back and forth. And now they're in the middle of a shipping channel, in the middle of fog, only half done, and it's 8 o'clock at night. And the problem is Bill gets super seasick because now he can't see anything. And at 11 o'clock, he gets super seasick. And they still, at this point, they're 80 kilometers from near shore, but they've still got 50 kilometers left to paddle. So think about people who have paddled. Most people in a good day, 20, 25 kilometers is typical for lots of people. And these guys, this day, they're trying to do 123. So 11 o'clock at night, they're paddling through. They get over the shipping channel, so that, you don't have to panic about that. They make it through that part. They paddle all the way through the night. The next morning, dawn comes, and they've now been paddling for 20 hours straight. They've been up for 24 or even longer, and they're still Bill's super seasick, but now he's fallen asleep in his boat, and they're having to figure out how to keep on top of not falling over while they're asleep. They finally land on Caribou Island at 9:30 in the morning, where Bill becomes immediately hypothermic, because he got to add some more drama to it. Comes out of his boat, obviously super dehydrated because he's been sick all night, and they are, so Don, his partner, sorts him out, shoves him in a tent, and they take the next day off for paddling. But they're now stuck out on Caribou Island, which is an interesting little spot. And it's been a life dream to go out there, and every time I think about it, it's very nerve-wracking, just even kind of thinking about it. So this is a small little island in the middle of nowhere. It's 6 kilometers long, 1.5 kilometers wide, so it seems big, but remember, this is a massive lake with just a little postage stamp of an island in the middle. It's really low lying. It's got the largest lighthouse on the Great Lakes, so it's 10 stories. That guy there. This is a little island. That's the Caribou Island in the background. So they camped on the lighthouse little island that's there. And it's there, obviously, to keep ships from crashing into it, but there's a lot of shoaling nearby. Edmund Fitzgerald, that sank on the, Gordon Lightfoot sang a song about it. The captain saw this and it sank right in that area. So the island itself it was used for a private hunting ground for a long time, and there was a little runway that was put on it at one point, and it was they hunted caribou at that point, and they would bring caribou out and they would stock it up until about the 1900s. For the longest time there was no caribou, but apparently there's some stories of them being super aggressive, and as it was described that they would drive the lighthouse keepers up some trees. I guess if they were head over the island, there's some stories of that type of stuff from that era. And so, it's kind of an interesting spot. I have a friend that went out there, and he said he had never felt more kind of lost in his life. He couldn't wait to get back because you're kind of stuck out there, and you don't know when the wind's going to come, and you could be windbound for days. So they spend 2 nights out there and kind of recuperate from this massive crossing. So now they decide at 12:30 at night, because they wanted to land during the day, and they knew the amount of time it would take to do this short run of 83 kilometers. So at midnight they start, and they want to end at 3 o'clock. That's the main goal for it. Super thick fog, but it's dead calm, which is pretty incredible that it had happened at that time. It's very rare for Lake Superior to have 5 days of little to no wind. Our general rule is for people who are doing trips, it's your kind of 2 and 10 days, you're probably windbound when you're planning a trip on Superior. I talked to Brian about this trip. He didn't go on it. He went on all the big training trips before it. He said, I'm so glad I never went, because it was just this miserable trip the whole way before it. So, why I like talking about this story is because it's an interesting story that ties back to Canadian history 400 years earlier, but nobody knows this story. These guys just did it. and they didn't tell anybody for years. Sea Kayaker magazine, which we talked about earlier, they eventually did publish a short little article that was written by them, but it's an interesting piece of story from that piece that nobody knows about, and I was like, that's a great story. So yeah, go to Agawam Rock if you ever happen to go by. It's incredible. Last section, 4 kayakers that you need to know. The kayaking industry in particular does not do a very good job of celebrating heroes of the sport. And so that's why I thought I'm going to do some research on different people and I'm going to talk about them. There's some people that you know and some people that you definitely don't know. And I feel that it's like new paddlers who are getting into it, you should know the reason why these people, you should know a little bit about them. Here's my first one, Paul Caffin. He was the Wanderer. And he's a famous paddler he's paddled over 30,000 miles over the last 15 years. 99% of it was solo by himself, a real introvert. And that's what he did. But he was famous because he paddled around New Zealand. This is back in 78, 79. Decided to take on Great Britain, 3,500 kilometers. Then he decides to take on Japan. And not in the correct order, but he also paddled around Australia. He was the first one to do it. It's only been done twice ever since. So that's in 81. That's 15,000 kilometers. It took him a whole year to do it. Yeah. Paddling by himself. I paddle by myself and I'm like 20 minutes into it. And I'm like, man, I'm bored. I need some friends to talk to. But I think his legacy for me is that he really celebrated or really showed that a kayak could be used for trips, but extended long journeys, which a lot of people, when we think about going out 5 days, 10 days, you're like, wow, 10 days, that's great. And this guy did 360 days. One particular trip is he paddled around the coast of Alaska. And this was in 89 that he did it. And it's only ever been done once, attempted once by somebody since, or completed, which is Freya Hoffmeister, who's just paddling around the world doing 10,000 miles by herself as well. Also a weirdo. But let's stick to this one. She is. I've met her. Okay, so he does this solo paddle around Alaska. So it's 4,700 kilometers. So this is right after he paddled around Japan. And the original plan is to do it all in one season. But he got stuck by the Exxon Valdez spill. So he starts down here, gets up to Juneau. The accident, the spill is up there, oil's everywhere. They tell him you can't keep going, which is the reality, because he can't land in an oil spill. So he finishes that leg, decides to come back the next year. And he ended up doing it over the second season and then a third season because it was just way more intense than he ever actually expected it to be. He thought he could do the whole thing in one season because it's just a small 4,700 kilometer trip. But he planned this thing, which I thought was fascinating. He has a book about it, and he planned it and executed this trip in secret. Nobody knew about it, and there was like 3 friends who were sworn to secrecy because he had a lot of problems in Japan, which was the last big trip he did before, where authorities kept trying to pull him off the water, and they thought he was super unsafe, and so he wasn't interested in the bureaucratic side of it. So he would secretly mail these cash food drops to the different places as he would travel, and he never told anybody. And so he would just disappear for months at a time, and not even his family knew where he was going. A real weirdo. So, just kind of a couple adventures that he had that he talked about is there's a couple stretches that he had to paddle like 100 miles and there's like no crossings or nowhere to land. And where he did land were just these little tiny beaches that he barely crash landed onto. And it's kind of this stretch that's right across the top through here that was completely inaccessible, which is part of the reason why nobody paddles this for it. Got attacked by a brown bear. He ripped up his tent. He still had 600 miles to go that season, so he kind of just taped it back together and attached some tent poles, taped them all up, and hobbled another 600 kilometers. This crazy story. That's Paul Caffin. Back in like the late 70s he was doing this stuff. Here's another one, local person here. So Justine Kurgenbin. So she teaches out here, but before she moved here, she was out of the UK, and she made a whole bunch of videos, and they're called This Is the Sea. It was a series of rough water paddling videos, and she traveled and did all these big expeditions and filming them and telling the story of these different places. She got to meet the Queen. I was pretty excited to ask her about it at one point. I was like, tell me about the Queen. And she said she was, you know, just stuck her hand out, shook her hand, and kept moving. But what I really liked, I've followed her career over the years, and what I really like is that she really brought rough water paddling to the masses. Filmed really well, told a story about going on big trips and big conditions in the ocean, and she was a woman, or still is, in a very male-dominated community. It's all men who are into rough water, and she was there mixing it up and leading the way. And so she's incredible. She's the filmmaker. Number 3, Frank Goodman, the innovator. So I talked about Frank already, and so he uses, as I said, I mean, he built a lot of boats, but he's like this legendary boat designer that built a ton of every boat that came out of Valley that are still around today, they're basically his designs. And his boats haven't needed to change in 30 to 35 years because they're that good that even today, how people paddle today, which is different than the needs of the early 80s or the 70s, they still work great, which kind of talks about how good he was. He started kayaking in '64 and started paddling in his 40s and became this whitewater champion whitewater at the time, in that time frame. I'm not sure if it speaks to his talent or the number of people who participated, but I thought that was an interesting fun fact. But yeah, his boats went all around the world. Paul Caffin, all the boats that he paddled were Nordkaps, and they were all his boats. He was a member of Mensa, so he was smart, loved jazz, which was great. But he passed away in 2017. But yeah, his legacy, it's his boat designs. Kayaking is basically the way boats look and the way we paddle boats come from this guy right here. There you go, Frank Goodman. Here's the last one, Steve Lutch. He's the community builder. You guys don't know him, but he was a real big name in my area, and I like to talk about him because there's other community builders here and in every community. There's somebody who's the lightning rod to get people together, and this guy was the lightning rod for both Ontario and Michigan. So he lived in Windsor, which is right across the river from Detroit, and he loved paddling on the Great Lakes, but in particular the Detroit River is where he really loved paddling, and he started the Windsor Canoe Club. This is back in '77. But he was another character, kind of like Stan Schlatic, he could tell 1,000 stories, and he had a story, all these adventures, and he could hold court anywhere, and people loved